like to welcome everyone to the first in a series of videos about the play Julius Caesar, written by William Shakespeare. My name's Ryan Griffiths, and I was going to have an orange Julius here from Dairy Queen as sort of a themed drink, but I forgot to pick one up, so I'm going to be sipping from Old Reliable Mountain Dew here throughout the course of this series. I have the play itself with me in this big collection of all of Shakespeare's works, and I encourage you to have it with you too so that we can go over certain passages of it together. So I want to begin this study by talking a little bit about the actual historical Julius Caesar and the events that led up to what takes place in the play. There's a sense that one gets in the first couple of scenes that a lot has gone on before Shakespeare chose to begin telling his story. Who is Pompey, for instance? We hear that name thrown around quite a bit. Who is Julius Caesar, even, is another question some might have. We get the idea that he's in charge, that he commands the love and respect of the Roman citizens, but his position of authority is vaguely defined, and we aren't really told how he got to be in that position that we see him in at the start of the play. Now, one reason for this is probably because in Shakespeare's time, in Elizabethan England, no detailed backstory was required. Everyone knew about this particular dictator of Rome and the conspirators who killed him. It was a story that had captured the imagination of the Western world for well over 1,000 years. We'll talk more about that later. But another reason to suspect that many people in Elizabethan England, at least the educated people, were familiar with this story was because at the time English translations of ancient Greek and Roman authors were popular. And one of these authors in particular, Plutarch, had just been translated into English by Thomas North, which became a widely read edition of Plutarch's works and was the chief source material from which Shakespeare created this play. It's important to talk about Shakespeare's sources for a play like Julius Caesar because unlike some of his other plays, like Macbeth, the characters and events that are depicted in this play were real. Now, Macbeth can be said to be a depiction of real events in an odd, quasi-historical way. There's one source, Holinshed's Chronicles, that mentions a Scottish king named Macbeth in the far distant, bordering on mythological past. But the character that we see in that play was largely an invention of Shakespeare's own imagination. Those in Shakespeare's time, and we today, have a much more clear understanding of the events that happened in Julius Caesar's lifetime. A lot of contemporary writings have been preserved through the years from various sources, not just one, about the life of Caesar, and so the history and the legend that is built up around him is to a large extent verifiable. One of these sources was Caesar himself. He left us two autobiographies before his death, one about his time as the governor of Gaul, which was a territory that pretty much covered the area of modern-day France, and the other about the Roman Civil War with Pompey the Great, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, autobiography as a genre wasn't exactly in existence in Caesar's time, and although he wrote the books, and they are about his life, it's more accurate to call them histories, and he strives for a sort of objective detachment in them. He refers to himself in the third person in both works, almost as if it's someone else telling the story, and we can see that there's a potential nod to this in Shakespeare's play, where he refers to himself in the third person there as well. Or maybe it's just because he's arrogant and he likes to talk about himself in the third person. It's been really popular throughout history to assign these books to school children learning Latin, because Caesar wrote in a sort of non-flourish, plain and straightforward style that made them easy to read. And so there's a good chance that Shakespeare himself read them, or at least the Gallic Wars one, when he was in grammar school at Stratford-upon-Avon, his hometown, because one of the things that they did there was learn Latin. Another source, and the one that I mentioned earlier, is Plutarch. Plutarch was a historian who wrote about the lives of famous Greek and Roman people from his time and earlier. The complete collection of his works is huge. You can see that I have it in 2 volumes here. But Plutarch's histories aren't like the sorts of modern-day history textbooks that are assigned in classrooms, which are basically skeletal outlines of what happened and nothing more. Names and dates, and that's it. Plutarch had a moral purpose for writing his histories. He was interested in the personal lives of these figures he was talking about, as well as their public achievements. And he would compare some of the people to other people that he talked about, and sort of discuss who went wrong and where, who did some things right, and who didn't. Now, as I said earlier, Plutarch's work was available to Shakespeare, and it's almost certain that he had it nearby, if not open on the table next to him when he was writing his play. I'd say it was definitely a primary source, and there are some passages that basically come straight out of the history and make their way into the play. He had a lot of material to work with, not just from the section on Julius Caesar, but Plutarch also covered the lives of other characters we meet in the play, like Mark Antony, Brutus, and Cicero. So what can we learn from these sources? Well, they give us a deep and extensive account of Caesar's life, including some details that the play skims over or ignores. We learn that Caesar, as a relatively young man, joined the army as an excuse to get out of the city of Rome, because at the time there was a faction in power that was unfriendly to him and his family, led by the dictator Sulla. He served in the army with distinction, making a name for himself as a soldier, and when Sulla died, he came back to Rome and held a number of important public offices in government, including being elected consul, which was the highest office you could achieve. You served in it for 1 year with one other person, sort of like having two presidents with 1-year terms, and you led the Senate in any important decisions it had to make. During this time, he formed an alliance with two very important men, Pompey and Crassus, and the three of them sort of held a monopoly on power in the government, and these three men became known as the Triumvirate. Pompey in particular was a great ally to make. He had been a brilliant general and military commander, and was consul himself 3 times throughout his life. And this triumvirate supported each other financially and with one another's followers, sort of stifling out any voice of opposition. So Caesar was then appointed governor of Gaul, a position which he held for 10 years, not without much shedding of blood. There were constant uprisings and rebellions throughout the country that he had to continually put down, which you read all about in the Gallic Wars. And what we learn from this time period is that he was a very capable military leader. He was basically the guy who never lost. He is, after all, the one known for saying, "I came, I saw, I conquered." And of course, you've got to take what he said in his books here with a little bit of a grain of salt, because it's hardly unbiased. He's writing about himself. But nobody ever seriously questioned most of what he said in here. His troops probably collaborated his story. The troops loved him. He was very generous, always paying them well, sharing in the spoils, and a close bond developed between them, which came in handy later. So there were times when he would catch word of a riot or a tribe getting ready to rebel, and he and his army would get there so fast that the enemy hadn't even had time to assemble their forces yet. They were so efficient and covered vast distances of land so swiftly. Another thing we learn about Caesar from his time in Gaul is that he was merciful. Those tribes who rebelled against him and survived the initial battle, he would always spare. He was always willing to forgive his enemies, and he saw more advantage in making new friends than in accumulating corpses. As we'll see, it was this clemency which turned out to be his downfall. It's not mentioned by Shakespeare in the play, but most of the principal men who were in on his assassination had actually fought against him during the Civil War, and Caesar had forgiven them, allowed them to retain their riches and their privileged positions in society. We learned that he even grew to be very fond of some of them, like Brutus, which of course makes the actual assassination that much more horrifying. Now, in order to seal the alliance between himself and Pompey, Caesar had given Pompey his daughter to marry. But nevertheless, the relationship between the two men started to stale. Both were suspicious that the other wanted to grasp supreme power for himself. Now Caesar's daughter ended up dying, which didn't help the situation, and the third member of their triumvirate, who could have possibly smoothed things over between them, Crassus, was killed in battle around the same time. Meanwhile, reports were coming in from Gaul that Caesar was constantly overstepping his position as governor, doing things that were illegal, and Pompey and the Senate, who were in Rome, began making plans to prosecute him when he returned. His time as governor eventually expired, and letters were sent to him from Pompey and the others saying, "Okay, now it's time to disband your army and come back to Rome, no dilly-dallying." Caesar wrote back saying, "I'll do it if Pompey does," because at the time Pompey had his own standing private army, which were with him in Rome. Now Pompey, at least in appearances, was championing the power of the government. Caesar's term of governor was over. He had been given an order by the Senate, and that was that. Now Caesar, as I said before, had an extremely loyal army backing him, as well as the commoners of Rome. He had made himself extremely popular with them by introducing legislation that benefited them, and by giving them gifts and money and throwing parties and other nice things. So Pompey said, "No, I'm not getting rid of my army." The Senate sent another letter to Caesar saying, "We mean it, disband your army now, or you're going to be declared an enemy of the state." And so Caesar said, "Fine, you asked for it," and he left Gaul and marched his army, prepared for battle, into Rome. And that's how the Roman Civil War began. To make a very long story short, Pompey and the Senate lost, and Caesar won. Pompey was eventually killed, but not by Caesar. After a devastating military loss, Pompey had fled to Egypt for protection, and there he was killed by the Egyptians, who could basically see which way the tide was turning and decided that they wanted to be in Caesar's good graces. The story goes that when Caesar arrived in Egypt, still in pursuit of his enemy, they presented Pompey's head to him, and he was devastated, talking about how Pompey had been his son-in-law and how if he had only been able to capture him, he would have shown him mercy. So believe that if you want. So after a whole lot of bloodshed, the Civil War ended. Caesar pardoned most of those who had sided with Pompey, as I mentioned earlier, and he came back to Rome. Now all this took place over a number of years, but in Shakespeare's play, time is compressed, so that in the opening scene we get the sense that Caesar is returning to Rome after just having conquered Pompey, and that's why the two tribunes, Marullus and Flavius, are so upset, because they represent the government, and that's why they're so disgusted with the people, because the people had always backed Caesar almost from the beginning. The two tribunes go around and tear down the decorations off of the images in the city that the people have put up. Now, what happened when a Roman general triumphed over an enemy nation was that the citizens of Rome would celebrate his return with something called a triumph. And it was basically a parade where the general would showcase any of the spoils he had brought with him and any hostages who would be chained to his chariot and be forced to walk along in his wake as well. And part of the pageantry was that they would decorate the various images or statues around the city with garlands and gold stars or whatever. But as the tribunes say, Caesar's victory wasn't over a foreign enemy, but over Pompey and Rome itself, and therefore the triumph paraphernalia isn't appropriate.